Hello and welcome to the Sullen Art podcast, brought to you by Frequency House from the Dylan Thomas Birthplace at 5 Cwmdonkin Drive, Uplands. I'm Iqbal Malik, and with me are my two Frequency House compadres and co-host Chris Horgan and Simon Jones.
Evening. Hello.
How are we doing, fellas?
Good.
Good.
Thanks, man. Looking forward to this.
Excited?
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
So this is quite an unusual setting, I think, for a podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the Dylan Thomas Birthplace itself, in the front parlour, in the front room. But we'll hear a little bit more about the context of that in a second. Got to say, I've been looking forward to this one for a little while, and especially our first guest, Geoff Haden, who's with us now. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you very much.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm looking forward to this as well.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. So, I suppose the first question, really, Geoff, just to pile straight in on it, is how did you come to own the birthplace? What's the story?
Well, the story is that in 2003, the house was rented by the city council, and it was the 50th anniversary of the death of Dylan Thomas. I'd developed my interest in Dylan around that time, and the city council had the house advertised as being open to the public for 2 weeks around the anniversary of Dylan's death in 1953, 50th anniversary. And I was driving past and I remembered it was open. I called in and I came away absolutely horrified at the condition of it. I couldn't believe how bad it was. I can only describe it as a bad student bedsit. The kind of house that if you were looking for a student house and had a list of 10 to look at, this would certainly be number 10 on your list. And if number 9 said no, you'd start looking for number 11.
Right, okay, just a bit of beeping in the background.
Yeah,
there.
we should probably inform the listening public, whoever they be, wherever you may be, that we actually are trying to film it, but the camera's decided to take on a mind of its own. It's developed its own AI. It's much like HAL in 2001: Space Odyssey. But sorry, you were saying, Geoff, I do apologise. It's going to be loose. It's in the very vein of what Dylan probably would have enjoyed, so it doesn't matter about the bleeping, I don't think, to start with.
Okay, well, shall we decide if the camera's still working or
Well,
not?
let's just go with it. Let's just carry on. Let's carry on. So you've said there about coming in to see the house on the 50th anniversary of Dylan's death. Interestingly, I actually saw a YouTube video by a presenter called Nigel Williams. I don't know if you saw this, an arena documentary. And it's the only reference point I've got for what the house looked like before and after. So I've seen a little bit about that, but just talk us through what the state of the place was, Geoff, because the surroundings now, it's like night and day. I mean, the decor is incredible. It's all period, from the furniture to the fittings, everything. So what was the sort of big visual difference between the two periods, Geoff?
Oh, gosh. It was... if you think of a house, people talk about houses as being tired. This one was very, very tired. And I think, as I said, it was like a bad student bedsit. The middle bedroom, Dylan's sister Nancy's bedroom, was painted purple and had a navy blue fireplace. The kitchen had its walls knocked out to form one big room, and it had sunshine yellow walls and pillar box red woodwork. Some rather nice MFI 1970s
Lovely.
kitchen units.
Yeah, a little bit like my house as it is currently, but
Well, I expect lots of people could identify with what it was like, particularly students in Swansea. And I think it was structurally in very bad condition, but that's something that we didn't really find out until much later when we started looking at the restoration of it. And things like the roof was in a situation where it could have fallen down. Probably within 5 years, there would have been serious damage to the roof.
So it was in that dire straits then? Because your background is structural engineering anyway, isn't it?
Fortunately, yes.
Fortunately, yes. So use the skill set there. Yeah. But I would imagine that kind of background for you has helped quite considerably then. when it came to actually doing the house?
I think so, because my background has mainly been in small buildings, in houses, factories, small office development, and so from that I had a feel for the house, and I think the other thing that I've done a lot of is renovation of houses, and that was interesting because if you renovate a house, and I think you can see it today, people are renovating 70s and 80s houses. They're changing the roof tiles, they're changing the windows. Everything is grey at the moment. And that is something that's relatively easy to do, because you're not doing it to a particular period. You're doing it to a modern period, so you're able to see what's in Ideal Home magazine and places like that. But to do this house in the period that it was in involved a lot more work. And it was, I think that was one of the things that I did at the very beginning, was not to do anything. And people said, well, how much have you done to the house? And I said, nothing. Well, why haven't you done anything? I said, because I'm still researching it. And I want to find out everything about the house that I can before starting to do anything to it. So the next stage for that was to strip off the wallpaper, and we got back to the original wall plaster and the original colours. So all the colours, this room we're in now is a deep green, which is a very unusual colour. It's I think, a colour that reflects Mr. Thomas's desire to be middle class and his conservative Victorian values as well.
And when you say Mr. Thomas, we're talking about Dylan's father, isn't it? DJ
Dylan's
Thomas.
father, because this was a new house when they bought it in 1914, and that's what we tried to do, was to get back to that time. So everything in here is of the period, and again there were challenges there that we would go to auctions and buy things. You then go onto the internet, which is something that was a curse and of great value, and it was a curse because you'd find something that was just what you were looking for. I think when it was made in Birmingham in 1850, and you find out it was made in Taiwan in 1953, and it was those sort of things that were part of a learning curve, of just trying to get things that were of that period.
What was the point? So obviously you appreciated Dylan Thomas's work before you decided to buy the house, I take it. I'm curious to know, at what point do you sort of make the jump to go, well, I hate to use the word fan, but you're an enthusiast, you perhaps have an academic bent to it as well. At what point do you sort of go, right, lock, stock, I'm going to take over the property? Because it's more than an appreciation and an understanding. It's actually inhabiting the space in which he grew up, perhaps had his first utterances, had his first formative years and experiences. I mean, it's a huge undertaking, and it's a huge responsibility, I imagine, as well, to keep it in keeping.
Yes, I think so. I think it's very difficult to say when I decided anything with it. I think it was the horror of the condition of it, and then 6 months later, reading that the city council were giving the lease up, and this is what baffles me about Swansea and about the attitude to Dylan. If you ask the majority of people in Swansea, what do you know about Dylan Thomas? They will say, what will they say? I'll put the question back to you.
I think you would probably have the response of, oh, isn't that the chap who used to drink at the Uplands Tavern, or some other premises would lay claim to his legacy? Because there seems to be an awful lot of that around the city, which, I mean, I'm not the biggest, what's the word? Not biggest is probably the wrong word. I'm not the most well-versed in where he used to haunt, but I'm sure that there are some people who would like to lay claim to his legacy. But then to answer your question, I think it might be a generational thing where there are some people perhaps of the generation beneath us three, because I mean we're all sort of late 30s, early 40s, and you know yourself. I'm not going to try and guess your age, Geoff. I would say 26. So it's a case that perhaps it's been lost. Maybe it's down to a cultural thing. Maybe it's down to the fact it's not taught in the schools. It's not valued as an export. I don't know. I was made aware of Dylan Thomas because I had elocution lessons, and funny enough, the elocution lessons I used to have was taught by a lady by the name of Mrs. Austin, who lived in West Cross, who went to school with Dylan Thomas. She passed away in her late 90s, and this was when was I think it must have been early 2000s or pre-early 2000s. She was very elderly when she taught me. So for me, I was aware of him, and obviously my family had, my family do have, literature in the house, books and whatnot, without sounding pretentious. So there was always the spectre of Dylan Thomas there. So, I mean, without sort of beating the point to death, I think it might be a cultural thing. I think it might be an educational thing as well. And maybe
I think it's an educational thing. I grew up in Swansea. Always knew all my life Dylan Thomas was from here, knew the house was here. I had a conversation not so long ago with someone my age, and they said, Dylan Thomas is from Swansea, ? I thought he's from West Wales, that place Lan. I was like, no, there's a blue plaque on the house in the Uplands that says he was born here, and it baffled people. And he's from Swansea, born and raised, so I think it's an educational thing on a
I think you're right. I think that's another point is the Larne connection, which Cwmdonkin have developed very well, and this I think the whole point I was getting to was that I think to simplify it, the majority of people will say, "Oh, he was a drunk and a womanizer."
That's almost like a tabloid sort of encapsulation of who he was. It seems it's very, it removes anything, doesn't it? So I'll just say that.
But I think that is what people like to do with this sort of soundbite, almost, of he was a drunk and a womanizer. Okay, but he was the most famous drunk you've ever heard of. And I think
good point.
Oliver Reed. Shall we go on?
Yeah.
No. I understand.
But I think that that's a Swansea attitude to things. Of okay, we don't want to praise him for his work. We don't want to be seen to be showing that somebody's good. Let's say that he was a drunk and a womanizer, and then that puts us off the hook a bit. Then.
Is it frustration? Do you think that Swansea does seem to be the last stop on the line, as it were, culturally? That's having no sort of umbrage against Cardiff, but in terms of being on the cultural map, has it seeped into the culture here? It's like, oh, well, why do we bother? Because nobody else seems to venerate and support us, so why should we? When in actual fact, as my father says to me, we live where people come on holiday, which is the truth. And that's my sort of sense on it. I mean, on a beautiful Sunday morning when it's, the sun's up and all this, and trying to sort of paint this really romantic picture, it is breathtaking if you just walk along the front. And that's just Swansea. That's Swansea Bay, just from the Meridian Tower up to the lighthouse. It is breathtaking, and
I think he would have appreciated the kind of scene of Swansea actually from this house. I mean, the sort of geography of this area has changed quite considerably, hasn't it? I mean, I kind of accompanied you as you were doing a tour of the house a couple of weeks ago, Geoff, and you were pointing in the back bedroom what the sweep of the bay, as we can see it, is now, and how that view is actually interrupted by new build houses around it. But back in the day, in the 1914s, you would have seen an entire sweep. I mean, it was a breathtaking view in itself from there. But what I'm kind of intrigued by is, what is it about Swansea that people here aren't necessarily as enamored or taken by Dylan Thomas, the works, the poetry. I mean, the guy was a real tour de force, wasn't he, in the sort of 20th century? America embraced him, but he obviously felt the need to leave Swansea to get out, to go to London. I think part of it was because the attitude of the time would have been, I'm assuming here perhaps, but the attitude of the time would have been that culture only happens in big cities. Do you think that in itself shaped his decision to move out of Swansea, to kind of get more connected, get more networked?
Yeah, I think so. But I think getting back to the point of people not appreciating Dylan in Swansea, it's the same with all things. When the Swans got promoted to the Premier Division, people would say, "Oh, they won't last. They'll only be there a year."
Yeah.
And then 7 years later, "Oh, I told you so." And they 7 years, which transformed things around the city.
Oh yeah.
You know, things that we probably don't see. The training facilities that are there that they put in place.
Well, the tourism went up. People, away fans coming down for the weekend.
Yeah.
Tourism went up. B&Bs in the Gower were full.
And the geography of the city changed though as well, didn't it?
Oh yeah.
I mean, I've noticed that. You know,
Yeah.
that the kind of demographic within the city has changed over that 5, 6, 7 year period. It's just how keen we are to embrace these differences and embrace those sorts of changes. I think, but I think it is disappointing from my view that we're not seeing more of it. But you've had quite a hand in working with some of the other local artists as well in terms of promoting Dylan, haven't you? There's certain graffiti. I don't know if other listeners would have been aware of this, but throughout the Uplands and going into town, you've worked closely with. Is it the Fresh Murals Company, perhaps?
That was quite interesting because that started with myself and Irene Mann, who is one of the local councillors for the Uplands. And Irene's a big Dylan fan. And she wanted to do something. The councillors have a budget. And she wanted to do something for two things to do. One was to improve the quality of the housing in the Uplands and to reduce the number of HMOs, and the other was to promote Dylan in the Uplands. And the first thing that she did was put some wooden plaques around on a trail which goes from this house down to St Paul's Church, down by Joe's Ice Cream on St Helens Road, which is where Leon Atkin was the minister and who was a friend of Dylan's. And then she got involved with getting the telecom boxes, which is the ones which are owned by Virgin, decorated with, I think we call it street art, which was done by Fresh Murals. And it was that started in this road, and it gradually went out in all the Virgin boxes in the Uplands. The next stage for that was to decorate some of the benches in the park. That there's a bench with a Dylan image on in the park. And what was quite interesting about the concept of those images was that the background is a copper colour and the image itself is green, and it reflects the colour that copper goes to when it oxidizes. So it's a verdigris on copper, and the copper colour is harking back to Swansea's day as the copper capital of the world. And again, this is something that is perhaps forgotten, that in the mid-1800s, Swansea was the place where 90% of the world's copper was smelted, and the price of world copper was set in Swansea. We then exported the technology, and the copper industry moved to other places. But Swansea was a very important place in those days. So that was the start of it. And what's interesting is the City Council have taken up that idea, and now it's a City Council idea in the rest of Swansea.
Well, getting into local politics. Well, but it's welcome. It's a podcast.
I was going to say, I think that's such a fascinating discrepancy almost between certain local politicians wanting to support the Dylan Thomas legacy and the kind of other side of that then, I suppose, where the council didn't really want to invest that long-term kind of energy and whatnot into restoring somewhere like this, because they must have had this place for a number of years as well, I'm guessing, Geoff.
They had it for 4 years. I think it is, a visionary thing. And I think it's the vision that places like Stratford had a long time ago. There was a man in Stratford who cut up a tree in a garden of a house that William Shakespeare lived in, and he made trinket boxes. And he's seen as the first purveyor of tourism bits and pieces. Stratford has grown as the birthplace of Shakespeare. Shakespeare brings £350 million into the economy of Stratford. The Brontes bring 650 million into the economy of the Haworth area. Dylan famously named his town in Undermilk Wood Clleregib. If you turn that the other way around, that's about what Dylan brings into Swansea. It's something that could be changed quite easily.
Maybe we should actually clarify that for people who don't necessarily know, because
my dyspraxia is kicking in. So.
Yeah, well, it's almost an in joke, isn't it? That Clleregib in Undermilk Wood backwards means bugger all, isn't it? And that was a deliberate kind of device that Dylan used, wasn't it?
Well, Dylan. A lot of Dylan's stuff has references that have got past the censor, I think. And Undermilk Wood, as a play in 1954, probably wouldn't have been broadcast on the radio if it hadn't been. Dylan had died the year before, and there was some kind of outpouring of grief about it.
Was it in reference to things like Polygata? Was that quite problematic at the time? I hate to use that word. Would that have been seen to have been a bit of a rub, the character of Polygata?
Well, I think so. I think the whole of the play, if you look at it, if you look at the latest film version of it, Kevin Allen's version of it, which came out in 2014, that is seen as a dream sequence. And it is this sort of dream of, there's Organ Morgan. Organ Morgan's always playing with his organ.
Very tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, yeah. Today that's something that is maybe much more acceptable.
But that's Welsh humour, though. There's definitely a large swathe of that goes through it. I was talking to Iqbal yesterday. Now, I've not read it. I own the Richard Burton version of it, which is the late 60s, early 70s rendition film of Undermilk Wood. There's a scene in it where, I think, is it Mrs. Waldo's, they're chatting over the back wall. And I was outside with Iqbal yesterday. I said, he must have come up with that scene, not that scene, but that motion, that back and forth over the back wall on a Sunday of the two neighbours gossiping. That must have happened outside this house. That must have occurred to him. I mean, he's taken the observations from the place.
Well, if you take it back even further than that, he has a story, Patricia, Edith and Arnold. And that's a story of a little boy who is getting filthy dirty playing in the coal house on his invisible steam engine, while Patricia, the maid who's supposed to be looking after him, is talking to Edith, who she belongs to Mrs. Lewis, who lives next door. And they're talking when they should be working. And they're talking over the garden wall. And the little boy is listening to this. And this is all, if you look at all of Dylan's stories, or most of his stories, have this kind of narrator part in them. So it's seen from a narrator's point of view and the observer. And that's what he was. He was an observer of people.
Yeah. I mean, one of the facts that shocked me a little bit, actually, about the house is that he wrote 2/3 of his work here. Now, I mean, I was quite surprised by that, but, other people, I was listening to a Dylan documentary involving Owen Shears, and he was saying, well, he thought that the majority of his best work was written perhaps at the boathouse, for instance. But, the fact that there was such a large body of work that was contrived in this house, in these walls, I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing. He was a very young writer, wasn't he, when he actually started making waves. But so would you say that this house had a kind of large part of the influence on his work, on his writing?
Oh, I think so. I think the house and the area, the park, I think the park had a huge influence on him. And that's a place that he would have gone a lot. I think when we were doing the work, we found a maid, Emily, who'd worked here for 5 years when she was 15 and Dylan was 16. And she said that to go to the park, he would cross the road, go across the garden of Uplands house at the back, jump over the wall and go in there. The biographies say he went up to the top of the hill, turned left and went into the top entrance of the park. I'd prefer Emily's version of that because it gave him quick access there. And I think if you look, he spent a lot of time in the house of his friend Dan Jones in Eversley Road in Sketty. The most direct route, looking at the contours as well, would be to go into the park, out the other side, and cut along the I think it's Victoria Road, Pinewood Road, and end up in Eversley Road.
So Geoff, how did you find Emily? So she was a maid in this house, right? So, I mean, she must have been of some years by the time you managed to kind of talk to her about...
She was just coming up to 90. We put a piece in the Evening Post, and her granddaughter saw it, and she contacted us. And so we went to meet her and her daughter, and she told us as much as she could. We then brought her here a couple of times, and she remembered an awful lot. And I think she remembered a lot because it was a very happy time for her here. It was probably the only time that she worked, and that she, in those days when people got married, they stopped working, and she stopped working here to get married. And I think that was, from her point of view, it was something that she treasured.
So how old would she have been then, Geoff, when she was working here?
She was 15 when she came here.
She was 15. And was that a live-in position as well?
No, she lived about 3 miles away.
Yeah.
And she would walk to work every day.
Right, okay. Because it's quite an interesting story about the maid actually doing work in the house, because when DJ, Dylan's father, bought the property, he was actively looking, wasn't he, to kind of move up the social hierarchy. Certain statement about buying a house, buying a new build house, a certain grandeur about the building in itself, and then having a maid actually working for you was another statement about your social kind of goals, wasn't it?
Well, I think you've got to look back to the beginning of it, that Dylan's father came from a fairly poor background. His father was a guard on the railways, but he'd won a scholarship to Aberystwyth University. And he came out of Aberystwyth with a first-class honours degree in English. It was expected that he would get a job in a university. That never happened. And I think that was because the universities in those days had a very rigid class system. They were fee-paying, which meant that the students were middle class, the staff were middle class, and he just didn't fit. So buying this house was a move up the social ladder. I think it's always difficult to look back on times, but this would have been a very desirable residential area. The shops in the Uplands were considered a much better class than there were in Sketty, for example.
And is that because of the location? Because they're closer to town? Because,
I think it was, and it had Sketty had the same links, but there was a good tram link in the early 1900s to Swansea from the Uplands. It was light, it was airy. The industry was all over in the east, so you didn't get the industry. It was close to the centre, so places like Langland and Caswell would not have been that popular because they were too far out, and it was this would have been the place to be. Buying a house in this area, as you say, made a statement, because he would have been expected to have bought a terrace house somewhere, like the houses that they lived in, where they rented before this. They rented in Cromwell Street, they rented in Montpelier Terrace, Sketty Avenue. Those houses didn't have mains drainage. This house had mains drainage. It had gas lighting. It had 4 electrical points in the house. One of them on the skirting, just behind the door behind you, and this was a very modern upmarket house.
But you've also kept some of those original features, haven't you? Like with the sort of gas light in the bedroom, for instance, in Dylan's room. Is that because all of those are still working, aren't they?
That one is, yes, yeah. All the gas pipes are still under the floorboard. We haven't used them. We have put new pipes in.
I mean, it's still a desirable area to live. I don't think it's lost that charm about it, and the house is very welcoming. It's if you've been to other blue plaque residencies in the UK and other places of historical importance, this does feel very welcoming. So without sort of trying to suck up to you too much, you've done a hell of a job, because you walk in and the very first thing that you feel is a sense of warmth. And I am sounding pretentious here, but you feel like it's still inhabited, and it feels warm, it feels creative in a way. That's what I got out of it. Now, maybe that's because my point of reference is having an interest in Dylan Thomas, but
well, I know. I think that a lot of people will come here and say that they feel as if the Thomases have just walked out. And I say, well, yeah, that's right. We're here because they've gone away for the day, and that is, I suppose, that was what we set out to do in the first place. I don't think we had any plan. We didn't say that is our goal, but I think that it was in the back of our minds that would be what we wanted to achieve. We didn't want to do a museum. This is not a museum, it's a living house. And I think that's the difference. I think that if you go to a National Trust house, even somewhere, Newton House in Llandilo, which is one of the National Trust houses where they say that you can sit down on the chairs, you can open the cupboards and look in. You sit down on a chair in Newton House and there'll be 6 volunteers wandering around making sure that you're not doing any damage to the chair. So it's not welcoming in
So
that
this
way.
isn't a house that you just want people to come in, have a little look around, and that's the end of the story. Because you put on quite a few sort of events here, don't you? People can stay overnight, and I think you're quite liberal in terms of the kind of people you're looking to get in. I mean, was it last week you had a local band actually recording a music video in here?
That's right. We had the Orange Circus Band, who I think are a tremendous group. They've got a lovely new song, which was written for them by Roger Daltrey, the Who's best friend. And
that was excellent delivery. Yeah. Well done, Geoff.
So they're hoping that that's going to go places, particularly when Roger Daltrey gets them up on stage. But the video is about the song, and the song is about a husband has died and the wife is missing him, and it's
quite in keeping, isn't it?
Yeah. So a lot of it is has been filmed here. It's been filmed in different places in Swansea, we've had television programs filmed here. There was a program before Christmas, which was about a Welsh composer, Morfydd Owen, who died at the age of 25 while being operated on by her husband for appendicitis. So there's a conspiracy theory running around there. He was a doctor, but he was Sigmund Freud's sort of right-hand man, so he maybe wasn't the right person to operate on somebody. Kind of, well, I think about 4 minutes of a 90-minute film was actually shot here. There have been others. There's a film, a program called Killers in the Edwardian House. And that's all about the sort of things in houses that you don't realise are dangerous, like gas fires that had asbestos in them, which ran around them, blew around the house. And in Victorian times, there was arsenic in the wallpaper. And that was actually shot here as the starting. The house was where it started, and then they went off to look at things in different parts of the country.
Health and safety's gone mad now, hasn't it?
All I could think of was a self-aware trouser press coming to get you. But there a tease made gone mad.
Another considered input there.
I'd like to ask you, Geoff, actually, is like, what's obviously we've been into why you bought the house, what you've done to the house, but what's your first memory of Dylan Thomas in terms of reading or stumbling upon it? What was the influence that got you into him in the first place before buying the house?
Well, my first memory was probably quite stupid, I think. I was in Swansea Grammar School, and I can remember as first year in the school, one of the prefects, who I later played hockey with, he announced to us that there was going to be some kind of concert or event in memory of a famous poet who used to be a pupil in the school, and his name was Dylan Thomas. And my first reaction was, what a strange name, because Swansea is not a particularly Welsh city. It's not Welsh speaking, and so there's this rather strange name where all my friends are called Brian and Colin and Dudley and
Geoff.
Geoff. And
I'm sorry. Go on.
but my main memory of that sort of little conversation was that the sixth formers in the grammar school didn't wear school uniform. They only wore school tie, and so they were allowed to wear sports jackets. And he had a sports jacket with leather patches on the elbows. And I thought, oh, that's fantastic. I would, when I become a sixth former, I want to get leather patches on my elbows. And I never got leather patches on my elbows. It's one of my regrets of school days.
So Swansea Grammar School then, in terms of the Dylan Thomas story, that's quite a central place, isn't it? Because Dylan went there, he studied there, but his father DJ was not a DJ.
So we're trying to keep it classy.
Yeah.
Abbreviate DJ.
So
Dylan,
David John, isn't it? So he was a master there, wasn't he? He was an English master.
Yeah.
But the sort of stories I've heard about Dylan is that he didn't really care much for school, did he? He wasn't really an A grade student. He was pretty much itching to get out as soon as he could. I mean, do you think that's a sort of unfair kind of summary about his academic attitude? Or, I mean, is there truth in that he was just kind of whiling away the time until he could go off and do his writing?
No, I think that's very true. I think that he started writing at a very young age. I think his father took him into his study when he was 4 and read Shakespeare to him. And when Dylan talks about loving the words, I think that comes out of that listening as a 4-year-old to the words of Shakespeare. He wouldn't have understood all those words at that time, but he would have understood the rhythm and the way that it was presented. And I think that's the thing that he started with. His father encouraging him to write some poetry, encouraging him to read all the books in the study, because his father had a very good library. It was books of the classical authors, the traditional poets. So he got into that, and he could see that this was something that he liked. And I think as long as he sucked up a little bit to his father, gave him bits of work to do, then that stopped his father pushing him to do anything else.
So his main education took place in the study next door then?
Yes.
That's probably fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, he was incredibly well read. I think if you read some of the pieces that he wrote for the school magazine when he was 12 or 13 are incredibly mature for that sort of age, with a knowledge of books. And that continued through his life. And that was his sole sort of aim. Why should he do algebra and trigonometry?
Well, he wasn't interested, was he?
No.
He just wanted to be a writer. He just wanted to be a poet. But the other interesting thing about the study, Geoff, is the link to something that other people may have heard more about, is the Cardoma Boys, isn't it? Related to the Cardoma Cafe. So my understanding is that his meetings with this more bohemian kind of group of people would take place every Wednesday in the study next door.
That's right. His father would go to the pub on a Wednesday night, and he was allowed to have his friends in there on a Wednesday night, and that's where they sat and discussed art and literature.
So do you think there would have been smoking and drinking going on there then?
I'm sure there would be smoking, because there is a story that Dylan was kept home from school because he wasn't very well when he was 10, and his mother sent him out into the garden to do some homework, and she looked out of the window and he was sitting in a deck chair smoking a cigarette.
But we don't condone smoking on the podcast. We should just
absolutely not. No, don't do it, kids.
But
don't do it.
you know what we don't really know is what the attitude to smoking was in those days. Whether that was frowned upon or whether that was something. Today I think it's illegal to smoke under 16. You're not supposed to go into pubs under the age of 18. Whether those things still applied in those days.
So do you think his lifestyle at the time, his behaviour at the time, whether it's smoking, not going to school, hanging out with this kind of bohemian kind of group of people in the house, do you think that would have been looked down on by the family or by neighbours or the town?
I don't think they would have been seen as bohemian. I think he was the one who was the bohemian one. I think the others were fairly sort of standard sort of people. Dan Jones was a very serious guy. He was very talented. He was a linguist. He was a composer. Vernon Watkins, when he came along, was a bank clerk. Very quiet, serious old person. And the other people.
One of them was Bert Trick, wasn't it? I think he. Is that right? Was he a socialist greengrocer?
Bert wasn't one of that group.
Oh, he wasn't.
Bert was the person who Dylan, I think, owes an awful lot to. When Dylan was 17 or so, he was acting with the Swansea Little Theatre, and he wanted to know what he could do with his poetry. He had loads of poems and writings, which were all up in his bedroom. And he approached a man called Thomas Tague, who was a producer in the Swansea Little Theatre. And Thomas said, go and see Bert Trick. He knows about poetry. That's that kind of... So he goes to see Bert Trick, and Bert Trick has a grocer's shop in Glanbridden Avenue in the Uplands. and he was known as the Communist Grocer. So he was a bit of a red.
That's a great band name.
It is.
That's a great band name.
Yeah. You've got your music head on again then.
So what year would this would have been after the Russian Revolution then? So how far in what year?
This would have been when he was 17. At 17 to 14 is 1931.
31.
Yeah, and Dylan went to see him and read a poem from his notebook, and he used to always write up the poems in the notebook when he got to a point where he felt that he had enough of them or got them right. And Bert went to his wife and said, "I discovered a genius." And Bert was the person who encouraged him to publish and to send poems to different organisations. And that's really the start of it. Without Bert, Dylan could be, at the age now of 105, still writing up in the front bedroom, in his little bedroom. And
do you think that Dylan had a sort of overt need to be famous, to kind of be successful as a poet?
I think he wanted to be famous. I think that he wanted to be seen as a poet, and I think that was where his ambitions lay. I think it's much more complex than that. I think his whole life is complex. And
well, it's just that I was just remembering one story. I don't know the facts. I think you probably do more than I do. But with regards to Dylan submitting essentially a plagiarised poem to a publishing magazine. I mean, I'm a bit surprised by it, if I'm honest. But I think part of that presumably must have been this need to get the foot in the door, because that only came to light sort of 30, 40 years later, didn't it?
Well, I think the whole thing about that was that was when he was 11 or 12. And if you look at the school magazine poems that he had then, they were very juvenile. They were funny, some of them, but they were quite juvenile in the way they are. The poem "His Requiem" is I think a quite well-crafted little poem, and he obviously, I think, wanted to please his father. I think if he'd have submitted a poem and it didn't get published, he was probably afraid his father would say, "Well, I told you so. You weren't any good. You get on doing your geometry homework." So he wanted to prove to his father, and so he didn't have the confidence to put one of his poems in. So he finds this poem in a 5-year-old copy of Boy's Own Paper and thinks, well, that nobody knows about that, I'll put it in. And as it happened, nobody did know anything about it. His parents thought it was wonderful. They framed the 10-shilling cheque that he had as a prize. It was from the Western Mail. And it was only 35, 40 years later that it was published in the appendix of a book of his collected poems, and somebody spotted it, and
I think it was a relative, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. It was some random person.
Oh,
it
right.
wasn't even a relative of the person who wrote
Right.
it, who recognised it as something he'd seen 40 years or 45 years before, and it was then taken out of the later editions of it, or in. I've got a couple of editions. I've got an American edition of it and a British one. I think in one of them there's a little addendum sheet saying that this should not be in here, and so it's just, that's extraordinary that something like that comes along.
So he plagiarised his first poem out of fear of disappointing his father. That is how do I put this? You can take the boy out of Swansea. You can't take the Swansea out of the boy, I think, in a way. And I say that with nothing but love for the city and whatnot. But there is a bit of a hang on a minute now, I've got an idea. I quite like that.
Well, he's a bit of a rebel, wasn't he, really?
Yeah.
I think from an early age. And that's one of the other interesting aspects to Dylan Thomas, was that he was this self-styled Rumbo, wasn't he, of Cwmdonkin Drive. When I say Rumbo, it's not the Sylvester Stallone 1980s film.
The speech impediment. The name of Rumbo. Who is Rumbo?
So Rumbo, Arthur Rumbo, was a 19th century French poet. Who famously talked about the derangement of the senses. This was part of his poetic journey.
He was a hedonist then.
I'd say he was probably more extreme than that. He would probably have called himself a libertine more than anything else. So, right at the far end of that hedonistic scale.
Did he die of gout? It sounds like he was someone who would actually, like a rich
crikey,
diet.
now you're asking.
Well, no, but just a libertine, you just imagine, oh yes, filthy,
right,
rich diet of cream cakes and wine.
I genuinely can't remember how he died,
I bet
actually.
it was gout.
I do know he died at the age of 37.
It's gout.
It's gone.
I was going to say something else, but,
But there are striking similarities there, aren't there? I mean, he sort of references this idea about this self-styled Rumbo, and he also died. Well, he dies at 37, but Dylan dies at the age of 39. When do you think that bad behaviour, that bad behaviour of Dylan, sort of started kicking in locally?
I don't mean to. Was he really 39?
Yeah, he was 39. Yeah,
that's 2 years away from me.
Yeah,
from your death.
From my death. But you
that's
see
scary and
how,
creepy, Chris.
Yeah, he's great at creepy. He's brilliant at chat. But you look at the stills from the BBC archive and around that time when he was in America, and he doesn't look, by a 39-year-old standards today, he does not look. I thought he was at least older than that. I really did.
Well, he also dressed a lot older, though, didn't he? There was a certain kind of image that he was sort of portraying, I think.
39 is frightening.
It is frightening. Oh, actually, another fact that was fairly frightening to me to sort of read, and also reassuring, was in the last 6 years of his life, he only wrote 6 poems, didn't he?
One a year.
One a year, which is slightly marginally more than I'm doing. Yeah. So I'm still trying to attain that golden height.
When Owen Shears says that he wrote his stuff in the boathouse, he wrote very little in the boathouse.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And what he wrote, he would have been developing from before that time. Because I think he felt that he'd lost it when he didn't write anything. I think it was in 1942, and then he produced Hunchback in the Park. Well, Hunchback in the Park was something that he'd started as a 17-year-old.
Well, I was going to say, because this relates to some of his manuscripts that he would have been developing over the years here, isn't it? And a lot of that material was here.
Well, until 1942-43, nearly everything that he wrote was mined out of his notebooks that he wrote here. So if somebody wanted a poem, he would look back in the notebook and find something that he thought, well, I haven't done anything with that. We'll read it. And something like that is fascinating. The Hunchback in the Park, as an example, in his notebook, it is a pretty poor poem, but it's got about 5 choice lines in it. And in the version that appears in print, he's taken those 5 lines and he's turned that poem into a structured piece of work. And it's fascinating to see that progression of that.
I have an imagination now of Dylan, could you write me a poem? Certainly. One second. Hang on, what have I got here? No. So like flicking through it, like almost like an artist's catalogue.
I think he did that. If a magazine wanted a poem, he would have a look through what he had.
So without being disrespectful to the boathouse, the most writing he probably did was shopping lists, almost in a way. So must get more matches. Woodbines are running out. Oh, the Spar isn't open. I jest, but I never knew that. I thought from what I had seen there's an accompanying documentary which is on the Under Milkwood Richard Burton release, where there is a lot of emphasis. It's sort of like, yes, it was this hive of creativity. He was there all the time and he was doing this and that. Probably my mind isn't recalling it properly, but that was the impression that I got from watching the documentary. It was like it was this buzzing place and he was hammering things out. And in actual fact, it was just looking at the view, maybe, in a way.
Well, he wasn't there an awful lot. He lived there for 4 years. 6 months of that, they lived in Chelsea. He was back and forth to America. This was his the holy grail for him was America. This is where you're going to make his fortune. So probably of that 4 years, at least a year of that time was in America. He was back and forth to London, recording stuff for the BBC. So he wasn't there that much in that time.
How do you think that Lan got such a big reputation in terms of the history of Dylan Thomas? How did that?
It's the romance, isn't it? It's the place. It's a quirky place. It's by the sea. There's this romantic boathouse. The vision of this romantic boathouse. If they'd have seen it when they lived there, it was a wreck.
Yeah.
If you look at the film Poet in New York, they do flashbacks to the boathouse, and you can see what it looked like in the 1950s. I was lucky that I had a couple of Americans staying here who wanted to do our Cradle to Grave tour, where we start here and we go through Swansea. It depends how long it takes. We can do the Uplands, Mumbles, Gower, the places that he lived on the Llanstefan Peninsula, and end up in Larne. And the day that they that we were doing this, the boathouse was closed because they were filming Poet in New York. And I rang Toby, who works at the boathouse, and I just rang him to check if it was open, and he said, "Oh no, they're filming." He said, "I'll see what I can do." And he rang me when we were somewhere en route and said, "They're going for lunch between 2 and 2:30. If you come here at 2, I can get you in." And we went into the set, and it had been totally changed from what it is now. And it should have been left like that, I think, because it was amazing the way that they'd done it. The walls looked grubby. There were buildings outside, timber buildings, because it was and the other thing that which doesn't show in that film is that the area in front of the boathouse, which people sit out on, that was open. There's a wall now which stops the tide coming in, but the tide used to come up inside because it was a boathouse. It was where they kept boats and where the ferries went from.
Was this the film with Elijah Wood from? How long ago was this film?
That was Set Fire to the Stars.
Right.
That was a film with Tom Hollander as Dylan, and he is uncannily looking like Dylan. He is the same size. He's small. He's short. He's got he totally immersed himself in the character, and but actually lovely guy.
Do you have a favourite of those adaptations and interpretations of Dylan Thomas? Is there one that sort of sticks out to you?
I quite like the Kevin Allen Under Milk Wood, because I think it's different, and I think it is more true to what Dylan was looking to do. Whereas I think the Andrew Sinclair one with Richard Burton wasn't quite what Dylan was looking for.
Was there a link between? Carry on, cough. It's okay. Don't worry. Poor old Geoff. We'll have to get him something for doing this. Was there? Am I making this up? Was there a link between Dylan and Richard Burton, or have I made that up in my head? I was sure that I read or heard somewhere there was.
No, you haven't made it up.
No, I haven't made it up. Okay, tell me some more, because Richard Burton's another very important person from this sort of neck of the woods in a way.
Dylan's death made Richard Burton a film star.
Right.
Dylan was working for the BBC World Service. His producer was John Arlott, who was a cricket commentator. Your father would know of him. Yeah. John Arlott, as well as being a cricket commentator, was a producer. And one of his assistants had seen a play in London and said, "Oh, there's this young Welsh actor who I think his voice would work well with Dylan on these World Service broadcasts." And so they got Burton in, and Burton and Dylan sort of hit it off, probably in the pub. But they hit it off, and actually when Dylan was going to America the last time, Burton was asked whether he would lend, Dylan asked him if he would lend him £200 because he needed to pay his daughter Ronwy's school fees. So the kind of guy he was, you know, he was no money, yet he put the children into private school. And Burton said he didn't have any money. And Burton always felt that he was the cause of Dylan's death, because Dylan had to go to America to make money because the Inland Revenue were chasing him. In reality, he would have gone anyway. That was nothing to do with Burton. But when Dylan died, Dylan was supposed to be the narrator in Undermilk Wood, and Burton was offered that job, and that was what made Burton a household name. Because if you think of it, in those days, radio was king. Radio was where all the celebrities were. This is why Dylan was recognisable by his voice. And the same happened with Burton. And that was when Burton's career then took off.
I think a lot of that, because you and I were actually, you know, because we're sort of almost coming full circle with the podcast itself, because we've decided to do it in the Dylan Thomas Birthplace because it captures the sound almost in the way of what you would have probably heard. I mean, obviously you didn't have the technology that we've got, but it's interesting that you're saying that radio was king, because the way that things have kind of gone in the past sort of 5-6 years, podcasts themselves are huge. And it's almost, I was saying this to you yesterday, it's almost like the democratization of radio. Because it's essentially, I mean, the way we're trying to conduct this, the spirit that we're trying to do this, the interview, it is almost like a radio program. I mean, that's the closest thing you could sort of say with it. I mean, we've got 4 microphones set up, headphones, recording to a machine. Obviously, it's going to be edited in post and whatnot. But it's interesting that it's come back to the radio in a way. And that's why we both sort of agreed that we felt it was very in keeping with that.
Well, one of the things I think that draws me a little bit to Dylan is that he wasn't just a written poet. He was probably one of the first spoken word poets. He brought poetry off the page. He brought it to life.
I think he was probably the best spoken word poet.
Yeah.
I've spoken to at least two people who have been at things where he's spoken, and one was in America and one was in this country. It was in a festival in Porthcawl, and both of them independently said that when he got up and spoke, he was mesmerising. And I think that's the sort of thing that comes over, and that actually comes over in that film, A Poet in New York, and Tom Hollander. I don't know whether it's. I can't remember what the name of the poem is that he. But it stops you in your tracks, and that was Tom Hollander being Dylan Thomas doing it. So what Dylan was like doing it was even better, I think.
I mean, if he'd had access to the equipment we've got, would he have not even bothered with a pen and paper? Would he have just used,
I'd like to know what Dylan Thomas would have used Google for. What would he have typed into Google?
What would he have typed into Google?
Yeah.
Best pubs in Swansea. Who keeps using my name? I never went there. On TripAdvisor.
Dear Boathouse.
Dear the dog and handgun. I have never drunk in your establishment. Please stop saying I sat in the corner. But no, I because it's interesting you say about spoken word. I never knew that. That when you think of poems, and forgive me for saying this in poetry, it does come with this lineage of being quite, academic's the wrong word, but very, all right, academic.
Well, I
it's
mean, you've got
highfalutin.
to keep, you know, you have to look at it in terms of what was happening at the time, isn't it? I mean, technology, as you say, was changing. And as a result of that, he was probably the first one really to kind of embrace it in that kind of way. I mean, he was doing these speaking tours, he was doing the trips to America, and he had such a distinctive voice. And you know, that was one of his biggest assets, I think, really. I think the interesting thing for people who listen to Dylan Thomas today is that some people feel that they can relate to the voice because of what he's saying. You know, he's got such an amazing tone to his voice anyway, but some people don't relate to it for all sorts of reasons. And I think one of them is because of the sort of upbringing he would have had. He would have had elocution lessons here, wouldn't he, Geoff? You know, so his voice would have, you know, sort of developed and changed over a long period of time.
In that instance, would it be a case that his parents were trying to just do the very best for him? Because obviously, if you can articulate yourself and enunciate and everything else that goes with it, you can sort of jump the queue perhaps a little bit in terms of class. Maybe, I don't know. I mean.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Geoff, what's your view on that? I mean, you know, his parents, and particularly his father, was looking to kind of climb up the sort of social hierarchy, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And he was doing everything he could for his children to do that.
And I suppose both his mother and his father spoke with a Welsh accent. His mother was from St Thomas. His father was from Cwmdonkin, so there was a strong Welsh accent. I think what's interesting is that the Swansea West accent is not a very strong Welsh accent. If you're talking to anybody from outside Swansea, and I forget this, people say, you're from Swansea? I said, yeah. And they say, well, you haven't got an accent. And I think that's fairly general of Swansea West. I think it's an accident.
Maybe we don't, to that end, have an identity. Maybe that's part
That is the
of
identity.
Is that the identity? It's
that's
the non-identity.
Yeah.
No.
It's a reasonably biggish city in the middle. Well, it's the middle of south middle of Wales, between, you know, heavily populated Welsh-speaking areas. Yet no one in Swansea speaks Welsh. It's almost like a little. Take Swansea in the Gow, it's almost like a little country within itself. That's the way I've always looked at it anyway, and it took me a few years to realise that. But
is it because we've always been a port, you know, and with so
Maybe.
much coming and going, there's so much multiculturalism that has and is coming through the country, through the town? Has it always been the way? I was really curious, just to go off on a tangent, to know where the name Jack came from, like Swansea Jack.
I know that.
Right,
It's
go on,
nothing
you-
to do with a dog.
No.
It's to do with the jack tars. They used to lay the railway lines. People go, oh, Jack, after the Jack. Was a Labrador, black Labrador, used to swim out and save people with barrels of rum and warm them up, brandy and whatever. And a lot of a bit like people thinking Dylan Thomas is from Larne. Swansea are not called Jacks after a dog. They're named after the Jack tars because they were hard-working people who laid the railway lines, and when the railway lines extended out, get people from Swansea, and they laid the tracks down, and the Jack tars are going, oh look, the Jacks are coming, and they were nearly always from Swansea.
Now, the story that I had read, there's the Jack Tar, but it was from from pirating days. Jolly Jack Tar. They were the best sailors.
I've never heard that one.
Well, that was the one. That was the one I read online. So God knows that's probably wrong, but it does come from this Jack Tar.
I think it's how you pronounce it, Jack tar,
yeah.
where people lay in the railway lines.
And in both stories, in the one that I read, it was like, yeah, they were the best. They were the best you could possibly get.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather believe that. Hard-working people. I mean, it makes sense, you know, coming from, like, what Geoff was saying earlier with a Copperopolis kind of reputation, hard-working people, and it builds up and it spreads. And I mean, I'd rather be known for being, you know, nicknamed after a hard-working person than a dog.
Or a pirate. Would you be
Or
happy
a
with
pirate.
Yeah.
No.
No
No,
pirating.
we better not get into that.
No.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Jack Sparrow.
Jack's, yeah, no.
Exactly.
Could it? Would
I
it?
don't know. Swansea
No.
Jack.
No.
No.
No, I would, in light of what Chris has said, I would like to think it was from the hardworking railway.
And not a dog.
And not a... Well, the dog's lovely. Have you seen pictures of the dog? The dog's really nice.
No, I've only ever seen paintings.
Only paintings.
So I don't know if that's an accurate...
There are a few... I'm sure I saw a photo of the dog. We have to refer to Geoff. Geoff knows more about Swansea than us three combined, I think.
What's the truth, Geoff?
Is there a picture of the...
There are pictures of the dog, I think. What I find strange is that a dog or anybody could rescue people on Swansea Beach because it's so shallow.
Depends how short they are, and I can speak from experience.
Yeah.
I look at a thimble and I worry. Sorry.
I think people were shorter in those days
They
as
were
well, weren't they?
saying this yesterday. Were they?
Well, I don't know. I'm just going on, no
Was the
factual
dog like a
information at all.
horse coming towards them? Oh, don't worry. Even saying that. We haven't got any horses. We've got the dog. Send the dog in. He's big enough. But yeah, I mean, it is. It is. I mean,
Who knows? Who
but
knows?
that's part of what makes Swansea great is the mythos. You know, that's only in Swansea. I mean, I again going on a tangent. One of the bands I really like is Badfinger, and the story behind that is tragic. Without going too much labour into it, but that we'll do that for another podcast. That story of them losing out on having one of the biggest pop standards, you know, I Can't Live If Living Is Without You, right? Because they lost out on that. Peter Ham lost out on that. It could have only have happened to a band from Swansea. It wouldn't have happened to a band from Scunthorpe. It wouldn't have happened to a band from West Brom. It would have just happened to a band from Swansea.
Can you name 10 bands from Scunthorpe?
I can't name one.
Oh, that's shameful.
But that's a good point. That is a good point. But I can't name 10 bands. I wish 10 bands from Scunthorpe. That's another good band name. So you'd have Communist Grocer and 10
Communist Grocer. I'm getting a T-shirt done with
and
that
10 bands from Scunthorpe. But no, you've got a good point. I mean, you can name 10 bands from Swansea. The Bystanders, Man. Oh, I've put myself on a pedestal now. Badfinger.
Son of Man. Son of Man.
Acrimony.
Black Eye Riot. Taint.
Taint. Hark.
Mines.
Man, Son.
Rusty Nuts.
Liberty
Nuts.
37.
Estuary Blacks.
Estuary Blacks. Who else is in that?
The Orange Circus Band, they're Swansea, right? Yeah.
Who else is in that? Come on, boys, we do know.
Cities.
City, yeah, absolutely. Cities. There you go. We must have hit 10.
Stories.
Stories, yeah.
We're definitely way past the 10 then, I reckon.
Boys from the Hill.
Boys from the Hill. Well, why isn't it's almost because I always had it in my mind. This is probably me being really what's the word? Oh, Americanized. It always felt like Swansea was like Seattle. It almost had like that. You know, wow, it's almost got that sort of like vibe to it where it's a hardworking town or was a hardworking
I prefer the term New Orleans, but that's for a different podcast.
Yeah, okay. It always has that sort of feel to it. So what? And this goes back to the very first thing. Why isn't there traction? It feels like there's so many good bands, so many good musicians, so many good artists. Why haven't we got more faith in ourselves? Why aren't we pushing
I think it's
it?
something in the psyche, isn't it? Perhaps. And that was the thing, as I was saying earlier about Dylan. He was probably the most successful export in many respects, and he left. So maybe to get on, you got to leave. I mean,
Yeah,
I
but
don't
he
know.
always said when he was away that he wanted to come home. When
Yeah,
he
that
was
is
home,
true.
he wanted to go away.
Yeah.
So,
And you said that 2/3 of his stuff was written in this house.
It was, yeah.
So
yeah, that's true.
inspiration is probably great to hear than
Yeah. Actually,
and I think you've got to look at it in context as well. He was living here, rent free, getting money. He was getting fed.
wasn't really earning though, was he?
He didn't have any.
Working at the tab. Sorry.
Didn't have any worries, and he was allowed to do to a large extent what he wanted to do. He worked for 18 months for the Evening Post, or the I think it was changed. The name became the Evening Post while he was there. He worked for the Herald of Wales as well.
I think was it the South Wales Evening Post or the South Wales
That's
or
what
the
it is
Daily
now.
or something
It was
like that.
The Daily Post.
The
I think
Daily
it was
Post,
called.
yeah.
And so he didn't have any real worries. And then at the age of 23, he gets married, and he's got a wife to support. Then he's got a wife and a child to support. So his whole life changes.
Was that whole decision about his about meeting Caitlin getting married, do you think that was about status for him as well? Do you think he perhaps rushed into that because he wanted to have, to be seen to have all the
No,
sort of things
I
around?
think it was that it was because his father had retired, and they'd moved from here to a small house in Bishopston. And again, you've got to think in terms of where was Bishopston then? It's 8 miles away. 8 miles is a long way when there was only public transport. You've gone from a place where he can walk to the shops, he can walk to the railway station, and he's a long way out in a little house. His world has gone, or was going, and so he needed something else.
Well, Bishopston even today it's a bit out of the way. It is its own sort of little environment.
Yeah, well, today there's a bus once an hour that goes past Bishopston. So, yeah, I think he was, I think out of necessity perhaps, was looking for the next stage in his life. And she wasn't the only young lady that he had on the go at the time.
Do you think, with that, going back to that Swansea sort of mentality, do you think people sort of get subdued? I mean, the quote, "the graveyard of ambition," is it down to the climate? Is it down to the fact that once the summer comes, everyone's like, I'll go for a drink, I'll just relax here. It's like, just put my feet up, it's quite nice, yeah, why not? And then obviously that starves you of the hunger. It's not starves you, sorry, it takes away the hunger to actually go forth and do something, because you go to the pub and you get into the sort of thing, I've got a great idea for something, I'll have another drink and I'll think about it. And then
Well, there's certainly something comfortable here, isn't there?
it is very comfortable.
Yeah.
And that's why.
From the sweep of the bay to the kind of gower, everything is contained within fairly manageable city limits, aren't they?
This is going to be a terrible tangential thing, but you look at somewhere like Birmingham, which is heralded as like the birthplace of heavy metal. So you got bands like Sabbath, you got bands like Judas Priest, and I can't remember anybody else because my
Def Leppard.
Def Leppard.
Oh, they're Sheffield, right? Yeah.
They're from Sheffield. So you get these hard-working towns where, like, a city that can lay claim to a genre like that, and they all went off and they did their thing, and it was heavily influenced and whatnot. And Swansea, it's kind of like maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow. I think about it, but that is not to say that the talent isn't there, because the talent, as we just said, with all those bands that we've recited off, and
that translates not just into the music world, does it? It translates into the poetry scene as well. And as Geoff knows, I mean, Geoff gets a lot of poets up into the house, either for feature nights or whatever it's going to be. But I mean, there's a huge swell of poetry kind of going on in Swansea, but sometimes you just don't feel like we make the most of it,
But isn't it a bit like you need a catalyst? And if you think about the Beatles in Liverpool, that they were the first from Liverpool, and how many other bands came along in the next 2 or 3 years from Liverpool? There were loads of them. Well, you can't say that Liverpool was the only place that a guy was playing guitars and banging drums. It was really happening in other places, but there wasn't that sort of groundswell of following of one thing.
So do you think that needs to happen again? That's what it's waiting for then?
I think that could be, Dylan's grouping, the Cardoma gang, that was people that that grew up around Dylan. He may not have been necessarily the sort of leader of that group, but he was the one who was the most successful out of that group.
I think that group leads to the main kind of influence on this podcast as well. It's like the stuff they used to talk about, the arts, like you said earlier, and I think that's kind of what we probably aim to do with this, really, isn't it? It was like a catalyst.
Yeah, I mean, it's cultural gatherings, isn't it? It's actually getting together and talking about it as he would have done in the study next door. I didn't actually realise that one of the reasons he had it on the Wednesday was that his dad was out, and he was basically in the pub then, was he? Yeah. Would he have been down in the Uplands Tavern as well?
He would have probably gone to the Uplands. Well, I think he did go to the Uplands. It was called the Uplands Hotel in those days, and there used to be a front public bar, and then a lounge bar at the back. And I remember going as a student. There was a big bar at the back, which you went in through the sort of big door. I can't remember. This is a funny. You can see it, but I can't remember what it's quite like. There was an opening which went to a stable block at the back, so it had stables when it was first as a hotel, and it was at that back end. There was a bar which was a student bar, and the public bar was where the Dylan Snug is now on the right-hand side as you look at the front of it. And if you went in there, you soon went out again, just by the way people looked at you and stared at you. And
it's like that today for me, anyway.
But I tell you what, I just the idea of Dylan dragging himself up Cwmdonkin Drive after getting tanked up of an evening. I mean, I bet that was a hell of a sight, because it's a bit of a hill, isn't it? This is a hill.
I mean, Just Eat have a nightmare getting up. Sorry. But where else? Because I really want to clarify, where else in Swansea did he drink? It's always bugged me, because I've like, did he really drink here? Was it? Hang on, that Weatherspoons wasn't even there. What did they say? You know what I mean? Where, to your knowledge, where else did he sort of frequent?
Well, I think it's a bit like everywhere that Hemingway went and farted, there's a cafe.
See?
No, I think firstly, I think you've got to look at it in a different light. In Dylan's day, the entertainment came from the pub, the church or the chapel, and from about 1926 on, the cinema and talking cinema. So Dylan spent a lot of time in the cinema in the Uplands, which is now a tanning studio.
I didn't know that was actually. No, I didn't know that.
There's a lot of education going on here tonight,
but that's why we asked you here, because it's like, help us, we're having problems.
Well, there was the other fact, wasn't there? We were talking the other day about the Cwmdonkin Cafe in town, and having this conversation together with Geoff about where it is and whether that's where it was originally, because where it's placed now is quite close to HSBC on Portland Street, isn't it? Yeah. But I mean, I don't think a lot of people know that wasn't the original place for it. I mean, Geoff, perhaps you can tell us a bit about that, because it was round the corner, wasn't it?
Well, it was more than round the corner. It was in Castle Street, about where Cinema & Co is now. And it started life as a chapel, and that's where Dylan's parents were married, and 1903, I believe it was. And then it became a cafe. And Cardoma was a chain of cafes. There were Cardoma, and some people will come here and say, "Oh, there's still a Cardoma in our town." And then that was bombed during the war. The whole of that side of Castle Street was really badly damaged. On the corner was a store called Ben Evans, which was known as the Harrods of Wales. And I suppose things like that, once that goes, you lose that identity. The other side where I can't remember what, the Swansea Carpets is on the corner, that row of shops with offices above, or flats above, I think.
That's High Street, isn't it, you're talking about?
No, it's still on Castle Street.
Oh, that's still Castle Street,
opposite Cinema & Co.
Yeah, the Copper Bar and above that.
Yeah, that was burnt out during the war, so the facade stayed, but then it was rebuilt.
We've never really gotten past that, have we? Because I remember where Salubrious Passage is now, the where View and all that was a car park. It was like an NCB car park for donkey's years, and it wasn't till the late 90s, and it's just, and it still feels like there's bits of that, and this isn't a jibe at Swansea Council development, but it just feels like
that's another podcast.
That's another podcast. I mean, they'll raise the council tax on my house. But what I'm saying is that it just ties back into what Geoff was saying. It feels like, why? I mean, come on, let's move forward.
I mean, I think this goes back to the heart of what happened to Swansea, isn't it? The targeting of the city by the Luftwaffe, and kind of, in fact, I think Dylan mentions this, doesn't he, in his return journey to Swansea, and he talks about, and there's this phrase that just kind of stays with me, where he talks about the city being razed to snow. I mean, it's just such a stark kind of image that he sort of comes up with, and he says his town has changed, you know, and it's quite a sad period of time where you actually get through, you know, that sort of part of life for him. But it must have been quite a disturbing period, I guess. But one of the pubs that he would have gone to when he was working at the what is now the South Wales Evening Post is the Three Lamps, which is, I don't know if that's the same venue, but that's reopened under the name, isn't it?
Yes, it's in roughly the same location.
So that would have been looking out onto Castle Gardens, then, is it?
Yes. Well, no, Castle Gardens wouldn't have been there.
Ah, right.
There would have been. There would have been buildings in front of it, and it's, the Evening Post was in front of the castle.
Well, I mean, we can talk a lot more, I think, about this, can't we?
I think we need, if this works and we're all happy with the end result of tonight, which I'm hoping we will, because it is technically a pilot, I want to invite Geoff back.
Oh, I think we have to.
Totally.
I think we have to.
Totally.
I've got
a little more about Swansea than Dylan Thomas tonight.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll have to put you through it again, Geoff. But
Geoff, just before we go though, if people are online and they want to find out about how to come to the house and find out about the house and social media, whatever, what's the addresses they can find?
Right, well, we've got a website,
yeah,
which is fairly straightforward. It's DylanThomasBirthplace.com. Sometimes it's up to date, sometimes I don't get it up to date. We have a phone number, which is a Swansea code 01792 472 555, and those are the best places to get us. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and if people can sign up for our newsletter, and we'll send out information about the house and the events that we have going on here.
Great.
Well, okay, I mean...
Well, I've got to be honest, I did have one question written down which I haven't asked.
Ask it then.
I feel like I've got to do it, and I put this down as an emergency question.
What's the emergency question?
The emergency
Where's the bathroom?
Well, I'll need that.
Yeah, so do I. So there's
in a
a
bit.
queue.
But essentially, I had heard some stories about the birthplace that it might be haunted, and there was a very specific reason why I asked that, Geoff. I know the boys are
believers of science.
As believers of science.
Have running water and electricity.
But there's been a few people talking about it, whether it is or not, and I just wondered what your view on that is.
I don't think that I'm able to tell you anything about that. I think that's something that you have to come here and stay overnight and experience the birthplace.
But not wanting to debunk this, right?
Right.
And I'm not laughing at you out of...
yeah.
If he is. I'm not sort of like, ich bin silly. It's more of a case of like, right, but think about it logically. There's old pipes in here that have heating go through them. So every time now and again it's going to rattle. Wood expands and contracts. There's going to be a breeze here and there. These sounds that you're
Right.
hearing.
So, okay. So the reason I'm asking that, right, is because I was stood in this room a couple of weeks ago and just doing a bit of reading as a poet in residence part, and I was stood next to the what's it called? Gramophone. I stood next to the gramophone, and it started playing. I walked in front of the room and it started playing.
But I said to you on that, what I think's happened is there could have been some family with a child, and the child's been really precocious, and he's wound it up like that, and he's put the needle down, and they've gone, Darren, come away from that. It's too expensive. You can't afford to repair it. And they've gone out, and then it's just cocked into it. It might have been knocked.
So it was the needle on the record?
That I couldn't tell you. I haven't touched it since, so I don't know whether it is.
I've played it since.
Oh, you have played it since. Yeah.
Well, they could have just been just. I want to listen to that, and it was, is it a dynamo?
Why would it start? I don't know.
Well,
No,
I'm not
it's
convinced.
a clockwork motor.
Sorry,
but it is very. It is, the brake on it is quite sensitive.
Okay, so has that happened
so
before, Geoff? Has it happened before?
It was a
I can't
mechanical
let it go. I can't let it go.
failing on a gramophone record that you thought you needed to call the Ghostbusters.
Well,
No, but I mean, I know what you're saying. It would be nice to. Will we get in trouble for that? Because it has the music gone past. Has it gone into public domain? Oh, it's been cranked.
it's been cranked up.
Cranked.
We'll soon find out. We'll have a cease and desist.
I mean,
or
YouTube
will flag it.
It's a creepy.
I'd love it if obituary comes through this now. or something just brutal, yeah.
Is that what you heard?
Yes, that was it.
There is a cool, creepy feel to it, though.
Herr Hitler doesn't know what he's in for. The boys and the GIs from the US are coming over. Normandy seems to be the day.
Sorry.
That is a creepy ending to the podcast.
That's not you. Listen,
We should sign off every podcast with that.
I think.
Right there.
No. I think if we're going to start
What,
this,
Geoff cranking up the gramophone?
if we're going to start these podcasts, I think we need to kind of like this could be a feature of like, let's dispel whatever nuance or little thing that Iqbal's bringing to the table. It's like,
I've got a lot of stuff I'm thinking about.
Well,
That's
welcome to the
I've got a
debunker
lot.
bit of it.
Geoff, thank you very
yes,
much
thank
for taking your time to do this with us.
No, it's been a pleasure.
It's been an honour,
It's been an entertainment for
Will
me.
you come back again?
I've got to come back.
Oh yeah, you're in the
Yeah,
house. Yeah, oh, there we are.
Will you
have us back
We don't
again?
know, will you have us back?
I've got to make the bed. So.
Yeah, but it's been a pleasure, Geoff, and hopefully in the course of the next couple of months we'll get you back in. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, guys. Good night.